Almost 30 years after Tupac Shakur was shot in Las Vegas, the man prosecutors accuse of orchestrating the killing is finally facing the consequences of a case that refused to disappear. Dwayne Keith Davis, better known as Keffe D, has spent years talking about Tupac's death. But now, those conversations have become evidence. And while the world has focused on the upcoming trial, there is another part of this story that has received far less attention. What has actually happened to Keffe D since he was arrested? His life behind bars has reportedly been filled with legal battles, a jailhouse fight, disputes with correctional officers, failed attempts to secure bail, and the psychological pressure of waiting for one of the most important murder trials in hip-hop history. And now, after decades of speculation, the case has reached the courtroom. So how did Keffe D go from a man speaking freely about Tupac's murder to the only person ever criminally charged in connection with it, and what has happened to him while he waited behind bars? Let's get into it. Dwayne Keith Davis was arrested in September 2023, almost 27 years after Tupac Shakur's death. At the time of his arrest, Davis was 60 years old. He was charged with murder with the use of a deadly weapon in connection with Tupac's killing. But there is an important distinction that often gets lost when this case is discussed. Prosecutors do not allege that Keffe D was the person who physically pulled the trigger. Their theory is that he helped organize and participate in the retaliation that led to the shooting. That distinction is at the center of the entire case. According to prosecutors, the events began earlier on September 7, 1996, inside the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. Tupac had just watched Mike Tyson fight Bruce Seldon. After the fight, Tupac and members of his entourage became involved in a confrontation with Orlando Anderson. Anderson was the nephew of Keffe D. Surveillance footage from the MGM Grand captured the confrontation. For prosecutors, that footage is important because it provides a possible motive for what happened later that night. They argue that the fight created a chain of events that eventually led to retaliation. Hours later, Tupac was riding in a BMW driven by Death Row Records co-founder Marion Suge Knight. As the vehicle traveled along Las Vegas Boulevard, a white Cadillac pulled alongside it. Gunfire erupted. Tupac was struck multiple times. He was rushed to the hospital and remained there for several days. On September 13, 1996, Tupac Shakur died. He was only 25 years old. For nearly 3 decades, the murder remained officially unsolved. There were theories. There were rumors. There were documentaries. There were books. There were interviews. And there were countless people who claimed to know what happened. But nobody had been criminally charged. That changed in 2023, and one of the biggest reasons prosecutors eventually focused on Keffe D was something that had been happening for years. He talked a lot. Keffe D did not remain completely silent about his alleged connection to the events surrounding Tupac's death. Over the years, he appeared in interviews and documentaries and discussed the night Tupac was shot. He talked about people who were allegedly involved. He discussed the confrontation at the MGM Grand. And he spoke about what happened afterward. Those statements became increasingly important as investigators continued examining the case. Then came his 2019 memoir, Compton Street Legend. The book became another major point of interest for investigators and prosecutors. Keffe D's defense has challenged the significance of the memoir, arguing that it was co-written and included fictionalized or embellished material. That means the jury will ultimately have to determine what weight, if any, should be given to those statements. But there was another important piece of evidence. In 2008, Davis reportedly spoke with investigators as part of an investigation connected to Tupac's murder and the killing of Christopher Wallace, better known as the Notorious B.I.G. Those statements later became part of the legal battle over what prosecutors would be allowed to present at trial. And this is what makes the Keffe D case so unusual. For years, the public had known him as someone who was willing to talk about the story. But after his arrest, the same public statements became part of the government's case against him. Then came the morning that changed everything. September 29, 2023. Las Vegas police arrested Keffe D at his home. After nearly 3 decades of freedom, the man who had spent years discussing Tupac's death was suddenly facing a murder charge. From that point forward, his life became completely different. Instead of interviews and public appearances, there were court hearings. Instead of moving freely, he was being held in custody. And instead of talking about the Tupac case from the outside, he was now waiting inside a detention facility for a trial that could determine the rest of his life. But his time in custody has not been quiet. One of the biggest incidents happened in December 2024. Keffe D became involved in a physical altercation with another inmate, Roslyn Hamilton. According to court records, the two men engaged in a fight inside the detention center. Surveillance footage reportedly captured the incident. The confrontation lasted roughly 30 seconds before officers intervened. Keffe D was later charged in connection with the jail incident. His defense maintained that he had been attacked and was acting in self-defense. But prosecutors argued that he was responsible for his actions inside the facility. In April 2025, a Clark County jury found him guilty. The case resulted in an additional sentence of 16 to 40 months, with credit for time already served. His defense later challenged the conviction, raising concerns about alleged juror misconduct. But the conviction remained in place. And that meant Keffe D was now dealing with 2 major legal problems at the same time. A conviction stemming from the jail incident. And the much bigger murder case waiting for him. But the jail fight was not the only controversy surrounding his time in custody. Keffe D and members of his family also made allegations concerning his treatment by correctional officers. His side claimed that he had been physically mistreated during an incident inside the detention center. Authorities disputed that characterization. According to the official account, officers were conducting a cell search when Keffe D became uncooperative and had to be restrained. That created 2 very different versions of what happened. Keffe D's side described mistreatment. Authorities described a confrontation during a lawful search. The dispute added another layer to an already complicated legal situation. And there is another important detail about where Keffe D has been housed. He has been kept in an intensive protective custody environment. That type of housing is used for inmates who may require additional security because of their profile, background, or conflicts with other inmates. For someone at the center of one of the most famous murder cases in music history, that kind of custody can mean significant restrictions. Movement can be limited. Interactions can be controlled. Privacy can be reduced. And the constant awareness that almost everything surrounding the case is being watched can create enormous pressure. Imagine spending years talking about your life on your own terms. Then suddenly being locked inside a detention center while waiting for a murder trial that could potentially determine the rest of your life. That has been Keffe D's reality since his arrest. And then there is the issue of bail. His family has repeatedly tried to help him secure his release while he waits for trial. An online fundraising campaign was launched to support efforts to get him out of custody. But prosecutors and judges raised concerns about whether the proposed funds met the legal requirements necessary for bail. As a result, attempts to secure his release were unsuccessful. So Keffe D remained behind bars. Month after month. Hearing after hearing. Delay after delay. And as the years passed, the trial moved closer. That brings us to the biggest question. What exactly does the prosecution have? The government's case is built around several different pieces. There is the surveillance footage from the MGM Grand. That footage shows the confrontation involving Tupac and Orlando Anderson shortly before the shooting. There are statements attributed to Keffe D over the years. There is his memoir. There are recorded interviews. There is evidence obtained during the investigation, and there are witnesses who may provide testimony about the events surrounding Tupac's final night. One of the most significant names connected to the story is Suge Knight. Knight was driving the BMW when Tupac was shot. He was also injured during the attack. His account of what happened that night could potentially be important to the jury, depending on what prosecutors are able to establish and what witnesses ultimately testify. Other people connected to death row records and the investigation may also become part of the proceedings. But there is something even bigger hanging over the entire trial. The passage of time. Nearly 30 years have passed since Tupac's death. Think about that. A child born on the night Tupac was killed would now be an adult. An entire generation has grown up knowing Tupac's name without ever seeing him alive. And now, for the first time, the case is being tested in a courtroom. That is why jury selection has become such a major moment. Potential jurors have been questioned about their exposure to Tupac's music, their knowledge of the case, and whether they can remain impartial. That may sound like a routine part of jury selection. But in this case, it is anything but routine. Tupac was not an ordinary murder victim. He was one of the most influential artists in hip-hop history. His music continues to reach millions of people. His image remains part of popular culture. And theories about his death have circulated for decades. That makes finding jurors who can separate emotion, reputation, internet speculation, documentaries, and personal opinions from courtroom evidence incredibly important. Because when the trial begins, the jury will not be asked to decide what social media believes. They will not be asked to decide which internet theory sounds the most convincing. They will not be asked to decide what a documentary claims. Their job will be much narrower. They will have to listen to the evidence presented in court. And then decide whether prosecutors have proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt. That standard matters. Because no matter how famous the victim is, no matter how long the case has remained unsolved, and no matter how much public pressure surrounds the proceedings, a criminal conviction requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Keffe D has maintained that he did not murder Tupac. He has also pushed back against the idea that his public statements should automatically be treated as admissions of guilt. His defense has questioned the reliability and context of some of the material prosecutors want to use. And that means this trial will not simply be about what Keffe D said. It will be about whether the prosecution can connect those statements to independent evidence. That distinction could become one of the most important issues in the courtroom. Because talking about a crime and legally proving participation in that crime are two very different things, and now Keffe D has to face that difference directly. For years, the story existed outside the courtroom. It lived in interviews. It lived in documentaries. It lived in books. It lived in conversations between fans. It lived in theories passed from one generation to another. But now the story is moving into a place where speculation is not enough. The evidence will have to stand on its own. And there is also a deeply emotional side to this case. For Tupac's family, this has never been just a mystery. It has been the loss of a son, brother, friend, and cultural icon. For nearly 30 years, they have lived with unanswered questions about what happened to him. A conviction, if it happens, cannot bring Tupac back. It cannot erase the pain of losing him at 25. But for some family members, legal accountability could still represent an important moment. At the same time, the family and people connected to Tupac have continued to raise broader questions about the circumstances surrounding his death. Some of those claims remain allegations and have not been established as facts in court. That is why the trial matters. It provides a place where evidence can finally be tested under legal rules. And for Keffe D, the stakes could not be higher. He has already spent years in custody. He has already faced a separate conviction. He has already watched multiple attempts at release fail. And now he is facing the case that brought him into the national spotlight in the first place. The irony is difficult to ignore. For decades, Keffe D was known as someone who talked about the story. Now he is the person who must defend himself against the consequences of that story. The man who once spoke about Tupac from the outside is now sitting behind bars waiting for a jury to decide what those words actually mean. And that brings us to the question everyone has been asking since the arrest. Will the evidence finally be enough? Will prosecutors convince the jury that Keffe D helped organize the retaliation that led to Tupac's death, or will the defense successfully argue that the evidence is too unreliable, too old, or too uncertain to meet the burden required for a murder conviction? Those are questions that cannot be answered by headlines. They cannot be answered by YouTube comments. And they cannot be answered by decades of rumors. Only the courtroom can decide. After nearly 3 decades, the Tupac Shakur murder case has entered a completely different chapter. The streets have talked. The music has talked. The documentaries have talked. Keffe D himself has talked. Now the evidence gets its turn. From that MGM Grand confrontation in 1996 to the Las Vegas courtroom nearly 30 years later, the journey has been extraordinary. Tupac's death became one of the greatest mysteries in music history. But mysteries eventually reach a point where theories have to give way to evidence. And that moment has arrived. Keffe D is no longer simply a name connected to an old story, he is a defendant. And the question before the jury is not whether Tupac was a legend. That has already been established. The question is whether the state of Nevada can prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Dwayne Keith Davis was criminally responsible for the events that led to Tupac Shakur's murder. After all these years, that question is finally being placed where it belongs. Inside a courtroom. And whatever happens next, the verdict will become one of the most closely watched moments in hip-hop history. Because after nearly 30 years of theories, rumors, disputed claims, and unanswered questions, the Tupac murder case is no longer just a mystery from the past. It is a case being decided in the present. And now, the world is waiting to hear what the jury has to say.